O'Flaherty's City Economics dedicates an entire chapter of the book to discussing the concept of racial diversity in city locations and how urban areas diversify the problems or circumstances that racial groups come across. For example, why do African Americans choose to live in self-segregated areas when they could be better off in more economically resourceful and integrated areas? Theoretically, O'Flaherty's City Economics evaluates whether racial groups are constantly searching for the state of Pareto efficiency and what they can do to reach that point. Pareto efficiency is described as a state of allocation of resources in which it is impossible to make one individual better off without making at least one individual worse off. However, the real world does not operate in terms of theories. There is historical context that informs racial groups of their relationship with one another. With that being said, the purpose of this presentation is to illustrate how segregation in urban communities is perpetual in nature and the disadvantages this brings to already struggling communities. There are certain variables in city life that must be recognized and weighed in order to get a better understanding of self-segregation. First, centrality is a concept that bears a lot of weight in the discussion that urban developers have about racial minorities in cities. Flattery explains how not only do minorities have an unusually high propensity to live in neighborhoods with other minorities, they also have high propensity to live in neighborhoods that are close to historical central business districts of the cities. Central business districts are generally described as the commercial heart of the city. Historically, particularly African American neighborhoods are much closer to CBDs than white neighborhoods, which is why the term inner city is synonymous with minority. Because CBDs are some of the most economically active areas in the city, who lives closer to CBDs is very important to the financial success of the city. O'Flaherty brings up all this to say that if minorities are not more likely to live near CBDs and are more exclusively the only members of the city that occupy the land next to CBDs, there are real economic impacts to be observed. There is potential for loss of business considering the perception that residents have about certain exclusively minority areas. If an area is exclusively one race, outsiders are open to make assumptions about things such as safety of the neighborhood. Although these generalizations may not be true, there is a strong deterrent for people to invest in those areas. The convenience and incentive for racial minorities to move near CBDs is something that urban planners and policymakers consider when estimating the return of investment in a certain area. There could ultimately be a lack of economic development if there is a large minority presence. The divestment in an area could even mean larger problems in the lack of economic and political capital for racial groups. Hence, an integrated neighborhood would increase the amount of resources for racial groups because the perception of the area would likely change. The implications of these investments are far-reaching. Increased economic activity can bring more business that sell a diversity of products and more transportation, among other things. Because minorities live closer to CBDs, one would assume that compared to whites, they have a shorter commuting time. Access to CBDs implies quicker access to public transportation systems because of the heavy traffic around the area. Nonetheless, the notion that minorities have more convenient access to transportation is statistically false. Data from the 1990 United States Census of Population that surveyed residents of metropolitan areas finds that blacks, regardless of whether they live in the central city or not, have a longer mean travel time to work. African Americans that are not from Central City have a travel time of 25.5 minutes compared to 23.5 minutes for whites. These differences are more evident within cities, whereas the travel time for blacks is 26.5 compared to 20.8 minutes for whites. Consequently, even when whites do live in CBDs, they have less difficulty getting to work. This study simply raises the question: what, if any, benefits do minorities receive from being close to CBDs if their difficulties are exacerbated even further? The question of commuting leads to a more serious question about what benefits that minorities get from living in such close proximity to CBDs. Thus, living situations are central to observing the disparities that exist within the city. The affordability of housing is a concept that O'Flaherty attempts to expand upon in the book. Beyond the fact that housing is a complex bundle encompassing structure, amenities, neighborhoods, and location, minorities and whites buy bundles that differ in many ways, some obvious and some subtle. Hence, trying to generalize comparable housing for whites and non-whites is like comparing apples to oranges. Quality of housing aside, most literature indicates that since 1970 or so, minorities have paid less for housing than whites have, or that housing in minority neighborhoods is cheaper than housing of the same quality in white neighborhoods. Nonetheless, integrated neighborhoods appear to be cheaper than both predominantly white and black neighborhoods, while offering the benefit of more increased economic activity. O'Flaherty assembles all this information to assess the merits of the question: if minorities pay lower prices for lower neighborhood quality, are the prices low enough to make up for the lower neighborhood quality? Essentially, he is questioning whether the potential psychological benefits of togetherness outweigh the possibility for higher quality of life in more integrated neighborhoods. In addition to explaining the conditions that racial minorities choose to live and work under in the city, O'Flaherty also explains the consequences of these decisions to remain segregated. Self-segregation is common in minority communities because there is a perception that they can relax more easily, find friends and people with whom they share experiences more quickly, be themselves more openly, cultivate their cultural inheritance more deeply, and understand themselves better. There will be more clarification on these ideas later, but the general idea is that it is more convenient for minorities to build relationships with one another if their social environments allow it. If race is the most important, if race is the most salient issue for a group of people, one would predict that the group of people to segregate itself along those lines. Moreover, these trends are growing over time. In the early 1970s, in Detroit, an all-black neighborhood was the first choice of only 12% of those surveyed, and the last choice of 27%. And 31% of blacks said they would refuse to live in such a neighborhood. In the 1990s, however, a quarter of blacks said they would go so far to refuse to move into an all-black neighborhood. But alas, the issue of self-segregation is similar to affordable housing and proximity of CBDs in that there is no benefit to the decisions that African Americans make. The psychic advantages that African Americans feel when they live in more concentrated black areas is not supported by the data. The arguments of the psychic advantage of segregation don't say how big a minority community has to be, that a minority community of 500,000 does any better at realizing them than 25 neighborhoods of 20,000. Therefore, the argument that there is a measurable benefit that blacks receive from being around more blacks is unquantifiable. There is no way to determine how big that community must be in order for blacks to cultivate a positive environment. If the benefits of segregation are unquantifiable and the perceptions around segregation lead to less resources in the future, racial groups should integrate because it relieves them of the lack of resources. If a flattery discussion on segregation signifies anything, it is that race matters. Minorities have longer commute times, even though they live closer to CBDs. Minorities disproportionately live in segregated neighborhoods. The decision to live under these conditions is partly the result of systems that have been put in place, and there is also a desire on behalf of those who live in the community to remain close to others. While we understand that from an economic standpoint, integrated communities are more advantageous, the psychological aspect is just as important. With that being said, our solution should work to make sure that those segregated communities are more economically resourceful without removing citizens from the environments in which they feel most comfortable.